The rain had not stopped since morning. It came in from the north, gray and relentless. And by the time Clara Winterbourne, Clara Ashcombe now, though the name still sat strangely on her, stepped through the great oak doors of Rothmere Hall, her cloak was soaked through to the wool beneath, and her boots had taken water at the left heel somewhere on the final quarter-mile of drive. She stood for a moment just inside the threshold, rain still dripping from the hem of her cloak onto the stone floor, and took in the great hall. The assembled household staff in two neat lines, candles burning against the gray afternoon light, the smell of beeswax and damp stone and wood smoke from the fire someone had thought to light in the east grate. It was, by every measure, a formal and correct welcome. And then she heard it. "She won't last a week, Edward. Watch." Her husband's voice, not quiet, not truly. The kind of voice that assumes it is alone in a room because it has not yet bothered to look. Gabriel Ashcombe, the Duke of Rothmere, was standing with his back to the door, a glass of brandy already in hand at 3:30 in the afternoon, speaking to the man beside him, younger, lighter in coloring, who Clara would learn was his brother Edward. The assembled staff heard it. The housekeeper, a broad-shouldered woman of 60-something with a face built for enduring things, heard it. Every footman and parlor maid standing in those two careful lines heard it. Clara did not move for a long moment. She was aware of the water dripping from her cloak. She was aware of 20 pairs of eyes that did not know where to look. She counted, without meaning to, the number of steps between her and the far end of the hall. 14, perhaps 16. Then she walked them. She crossed the hall without hurrying, stopped in front of her husband, and curtsied with the precise composure of a woman who had spent 29 years learning how to be useful in rooms where she was not expected to be anything more. Gabriel turned at the movement and had the grace, at least, to go briefly still. "Your Grace," Clara said, "I apologize for the delay. The road from the village was slower than anticipated." He recovered. He was, she would learn, very good at recovering. "Clara, you've arrived." "I have," she agreed. And then she turned to the housekeeper, whose expression was the most carefully neutral thing Clara had ever seen on a human face. "Mrs. Pruitt, I believe. I wonder if you might show me the nursery. I should like to meet the children before the light goes." Mrs. Pruitt said, "Of course, Your Grace." And that was that. The stairs at Rothmere were wide and cold, the carpet runner thinning at the edges in a way that suggested no one had looked at it closely in some years. Clara was 3 steps up when she became aware of being watched. She looked up and found a child on the landing above, 9 years old perhaps, dark-haired, with the specific watchfulness of a creature that has learned not to trust arrivals. The child did not move or speak. She simply looked down at Clara with eyes that were already measuring distances, already calculating exits. "You must be Alice," Clara said. The child said nothing. She had the look of a girl who had watched 2 governesses leave in the past year and had decided the sensible position was to withhold judgment indefinitely. "I'm not going to ask you to come down," Clara told her. "I'm going to the nursery. You're welcome to follow if you like, or not, as you prefer." She continued up the stairs. Behind her, after a moment's pause, she heard small feet on the carpet runner. The nursery at Rothmere had not been mismanaged through cruelty. That was the first thing Clara understood when she sat down at the small desk that evening. The 2 younger children already asleep, and Alice watching from the doorway with her arms folded, and read through the notes the previous governesses had left. The mismanagement had been accomplished through simple absence. No one had been watching. The schedules were erratic. The children's physician had not visited in 4 months. One of the younger wards, a boy of 6 named Thomas, had a recurring cough that had been noted in both governess's records and addressed by neither. Clara wrote 3 items on a fresh sheet of paper and set it beside the lamp. Downstairs, dinner was formal and correct. Gabriel sat at the head of the long table and spoke, when he spoke at all, about the estate's drainage issues and a dispute with a neighboring landowner. Clara listened and answered when addressed, and asked 2 questions about the north field that she could tell. From the brief pause they produced, he had not expected her to ask. At the far end of the table, Lady Priscilla Fenwick, Gabriel's cousin, Clara had been told, though the relationship seemed to carry the weight of something more complicated, sat with the particular composure of a woman who had arranged herself in this room for a long time and did not intend to be rearranged. "Your father's parish?" Priscilla said, during a gap between courses, addressing Clara with a brightness that had nothing warm in it. "Millbrook, isn't it? I believe I passed through once, years ago. Very pastoral." "It is," Clara said. "And quite small, I imagine, the congregation." 40 families in good years," Clara said. "Fewer after the fever outbreak of 1847. Priscilla smiled. How testing that must have been. "It was," Clara agreed, and said nothing more, because there was nothing more she intended to give that particular line of inquiry. Gabriel did not redirect the conversation. He reached for his wine and looked at the middle distance, which Clara noted and filed away. Later, making her way along the master corridor toward her rooms, she heard 2 housemaids speaking in the alcove near the linen cupboard, not quietly enough, or not aware she was there. "Always said she left for a man, didn't she? The first one." "Seraphina. That's what Mrs. Pruitt said. Ran off with someone from the London set. His Grace never spoke of it after. Can't blame him for being cold, then. Once burned." Clara stood still in the corridor until the voices moved away. Then she went to her room, lit the lamp on the writing table, and did not sleep. She counted the items on her list instead and added a 4th. "Physician for Thomas. Arrange by end of the week." 3 weeks into her marriage, Clara requested the household account ledgers from Mr. Ferris, the estate steward, who was a man of 50-odd years, with the expression of someone who had long ago decided that the safest position was to produce documents only when directly asked for them. He hesitated. "The ledgers are kept in the estate study, Your Grace. His Grace, generally." "I understand," Clara said. "I'm asking for them now." He produced them. She spent 3 days with the books spread across the study table, working by morning light when the house was quiet. What she found was not fraud. She had half expected fraud, and fraud would have been simpler. What she found was neglect recorded in columns, payments that had run unchecked, contracts renewed without renegotiation, a standing arrangement with the grain supplier that had been overpaying by nearly 8% for 2 years. Not a conspiracy. Simply no one looking. She began correcting the accounts in her own hand, annotating as she went. She was in the middle of the 3rd year's records when the door to the study opened. Gabriel stood in the doorway, and she could tell from the set of his shoulders that he had not expected to find her there. He had a letter in his hand, from his solicitor, she would learn later. "You've been in the accounts," he said. "Yes," Clara said. She did not look up immediately. She finished the annotation she was writing, set down the pen, and then looked at him. "The grain supplier has been overpaid since 1849. I've drafted a letter to renegotiate the contract. I'll have the quarterly summary ready by Friday." A pause. He looked at the table, 3 years of ledgers, organized and annotated in a clean hand. "Did you find what you were looking for?" he asked. "I found what needed doing," Clara said. "I generally do." He looked at her for a moment that went on slightly longer than the question required. Then he said nothing, turned, and left. The solicitor told him about the grain overpayment 2 days later. Clara knew this because the grain supplier received her letter of renegotiation without any objection from the estate. Gabriel did not mention it to her. She did not expect him to. In the weeks that followed, Clara's competence accumulated in the way that water accumulates. Quietly, without announcement. Until one day the ground is simply different than it was. Alice was writing her letters with increasing confidence, guided each evening by a method Clara had developed during the fever years in Millbrook, when she had taught 3 younger siblings to read by lamplight while their father tended the sick. Thomas's cough was examined, diagnosed as a minor bronchial irritation, and prescribed a course of treatment that had him sleeping through the night within a fortnight. The household correspondence backlog, which had apparently been managed by a system of strategic avoidance, cleared inside 2 weeks. Priscilla visited twice. Each time, she found reasons to speak to Gabriel about Clara in terms of apparent concern, never direct, always soft, always in the register of a woman who wished only the best for everyone involved. "I do worry she finds it overwhelming," Priscilla said on the second visit, standing with Gabriel near the library window while Clara was upstairs with the children. "Rothmere is a great deal for someone who hasn't, well, she's clearly capable in her way. I only wonder if her way is quite equal to the demands here." Gabriel said nothing either way. He looked out the window at the gray autumn lawn and turned his brandy glass slowly in his hand. On a Tuesday in the 3rd week, crossing the east terrace after inspecting the north field drainage, Clara's boot found a patch of rain-slicked stone and she lurched sideways. Gabriel's hand caught her elbow. A fast, automatic movement, the reflex of a man standing close enough to reach. He steadied her and then withdrew his hand almost immediately, as if the gesture had startled him. Clara straightened without comment. They walked the remaining length of the terrace in silence. A week later, in the nursery, they sat side by side over Alice's writing slate, while the child worked through a row of letters. Gabriel leaned in to point out a correction, and his hand came down over Clara's on the slate to guide the chalk. He corrected the letter. His hand stayed. 1 beat. 2. Alice looked up at neither of them, concentrating on her work. Then Gabriel withdrew and sat back, and no one said anything about it. And Clara found herself thinking about it at 2 in the morning while she counted the items on her list. The village assembly rooms on a November evening held the particular combination of candlelight, cold drafts, and social performance that Clara had encountered in various forms all her life, though never quite at this altitude. A dozen county families were present, the Fenwick cousins, a baronet from the next parish, several wives of men who owned land and knew the difference between land owned for generations and land recently married into. Clara wore her best blue wool and stood beside Gabriel at the beginning of the evening. And then he drifted toward the men near the fireplace in the way that husbands drifted, and she was left with the room. Priscilla found her near the punch table. "Lady Ashcombe?" Priscilla said, with the particular brightness she kept for public occasions. "How are you finding the autumn at Rothmere? It can be rather taxing, I imagine, for someone just establishing herself." "I find it suits me well enough," Clara said. "And the household? The management of an estate like Rothmere is quite different from smaller situations. Do you find you're managing? Before Rothmere finds someone more suited to its particular demands, I mean." The room was not silent, but several people nearby had the kind of stillness that meant they were listening. Clara set down her glass. "I found it straightforward enough," she said. The grain supplier contract was running an overpayment of nearly 8%. I've renegotiated it, which should recover the difference by spring. The nursery physician schedule had lapsed for 4 months, so I've established a monthly arrangement with Dr. Hartley from the village. And the drainage issue on the north field that the steward had flagged in August. I've had the necessary work ordered. It should be resolved before the ground freezes. She said each item precisely, with the specific detail of a woman who had done the work herself and knew every number in it. The room registered it. Priscilla's brightness didn't falter. She was too accomplished for that. But something behind it recalibrated. "How very thorough," Priscilla said. "I was raised to be useful," Clara said pleasantly. "I found the habit difficult to break." Across the room, Gabrielle was watching. She could feel it without looking. She did not look. The carriage ride home was entirely silent. The rain had returned. It always seemed to be raining at Rothmere. And Clara watched it streak the carriage window and thought about the north field and whether the drainage order had been specific enough about the depth of the channel. The next morning, her breakfast tray arrived with the tea and the usual bread, and laid across the tray was a shawl. Not new. The wool had the particular softness of something long worn. Clara lifted it and looked at the embroidery along the border. Small blue flowers, worked in a hand that was not Mrs. Pruitt's, not anyone on the current household staff. She turned it over. She understood with a certainty she could not have explained that it had belonged to Serafina. Gabriel had sent it, without a word, without explanation. She sat with the shawl across her lap for a long time, her tea going cold. She wore it once, that afternoon, walking the east corridor. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the cedar chest at the foot of her bed, and lay awake that night trying to understand what a man meant by giving his dead wife's shawl to his living one, and arriving at no conclusion that satisfied her. 4 days after the assembly, Mrs. Pruitt collapsed in the upper corridor outside the linen room. Clara heard the sound, a heavy, wrong sound, nothing like a stumble, and was out of the nursery and down the passage before any of the housemaids had gathered their wits. She found the older woman on the floor, breathing in a way that Clara recognized from the fever years. Labored, shallow, the body working too hard for what it was getting. Dr. Hartley came within the hour. He spoke to Clara in the corridor outside the housekeeper's room, his voice low. "Her lungs," he said. "It's been building for some time. I suspect she's known and said nothing." He paused. "A matter of weeks, I would say. Possibly less." "Does she have family?" "A niece in Derbyshire. I'll send word." Mrs. Pruitt was awake when Clara went in that afternoon. She lay in the narrow housekeeper's bed with the particular stillness of a woman who has decided to stop spending energy on things that do not matter. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice had a new quality to it, scraped, effortful. "Don't," Clara said. "Rest." "I sent for you," Mrs. Pruitt said. "Not His Grace. I need you to understand that. I sent for you." Clara sat down in the chair beside the bed. What came out of the older woman over the next half hour came in pieces, in sentences that cost her breath she could not well afford. Clara did not interrupt. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and listened to a woman dismantle the story she had built and lived with for 3 years. Serafina had not left for a lover. There had been no lover. The rumor that had passed through the household and out into the county and back again until it had the density of fact, had begun with Mrs. Pruitt herself. A grudge, she said, a relation dismissed from service on Serafina's recommendation, fairly dismissed. But Mrs. Pruitt had not seen it that way at the time. A small lie told to one housemaid in a moment of spite. that had grown in the way that lies grow when no one has reason to correct them. The truth. Serafina had received word that her mother was dying. She had asked Gabriel for the carriage. Gabriel, distracted by a crisis with the estate debts that week, had said no, not cruelly, not permanently, meaning to address it the following day. He had not understood the urgency. Serafina, who had understood it, had arranged her own passage on a hired coach. The road was poor. There had been an accident. She had not survived it. Gabriel had never known the carriage had been refused. By the time the full account reached him, grief had already closed around the story like scar tissue, and Mrs. Pruitt's lie was already running beneath it, giving it a shape that absolved everyone except the dead woman. "There's a letter," Mrs. Pruitt said. She reached beneath her pillow with a hand that trembled and produced an envelope, sealed but worn at the edges, the wax cracked and repressed. She wrote it the morning she left. For him. I intercepted it when the coach brought her things back. I told myself I was protecting him. I was not protecting him. Clara took the letter. It was lighter than it should have been for what it contained. "I'm sorry," Mrs. Pruitt said. It was the plainest thing Clara had heard from her, and the most expensive. "Rest now," Clara said. "I'll come back this evening." She sat with the letter in her hands for a moment in the corridor outside, the household moving around her, and then she put it in the pocket of her dress and went to check on Thomas's cough. That night, near dawn, the door to Mrs. Pruitt's room opened and Gabriel came in. He was still dressed. He had not slept, Clara thought, or had tried and abandoned the attempt. He looked at Clara in the chair beside the sleeping woman and did not ask why she was there or how long she had been there. He went to the small table by the window and poured tea from the pot that had gone lukewarm and brought it to her. He sat down in the chair on the other side of the bed. After a moment, in the dark and the quiet, his hand found hers on the arm of the chair. He did not speak. Neither did she. Outside the window, the sky was beginning to separate itself from the darkness, very slowly, the way it does in November, when the light arrives reluctantly and the cold comes with it. His hand stayed until morning. Clara carried the letter for 3 weeks. She read it once, the morning after Mrs. Pruitt's confession, standing at the window of her room with the early light coming gray through the glass. It was a short letter. Serafina had written it quickly in a hand that was not entirely steady. A woman writing between the decision to go and the moment of going, expecting to be home in 4 days, expecting to have a conversation she was already composing in her head. There was no accusation in it. There was no bitterness. There was only a wife writing to a husband she fully intended to return to, telling him she had gone to her mother, that she was sorry to go without speaking to him, that she would explain everything when she was back. Clara folded it and put it in the pocket of her day dress and wore it there like a stone. She watched Gabriel during those 3 weeks. She watched the way he sat with Alice over the writing slate in the evenings, patient in a way he was not patient with adults, correcting her letters without impatience. She watched him check the nursery passage at night. She knew he did this because she had mapped the back corridors of the house and understood which floorboards spoke. Pausing outside each door for long enough to hear the children breathing, then moving on. She watched him begin to speak to her about the estate differently, asking her opinion about the spring planting schedule, mentioning the solicitor's letter as if her response to it mattered. Looking up from the dinner table when she spoke, as if he expected to hear something worth hearing. Then Priscilla visited. She arrived on a Tuesday with the particular energy of a woman who has received information she considers useful. She found Gabriel in the library, and Clara heard from the corridor the shape of the conversation without the words, the low murmur of concern, the brief pause of a man listening. At dinner, Gabriel was formally correct again. He answered her questions about the household with brief, complete sentences. He did not look up when she spoke. After dinner, she went to the nursery and sat with Alice until the child fell asleep. And then she sat alone in the small nursery chair and turned the letter over in her pocket. She did not know what Priscilla had said. She knew only the effect of it, which was Gabriel retreating behind the same wall he had built on the day she arrived. And that wall was built on a lie. And she was holding the truth of it in her pocket. And she did not know whether giving it to him now would free him or simply give him a new reason to hold her at arm's length. She began checking the children's rooms at night. She told herself it was habit, the habit of a woman who had nursed a parish through fever and knew that children's conditions changed fastest in the small hours. She also began walking the old servants' passages, the back corridors that the current staff had forgotten, the narrow routes behind the main walls that connected the nursery wing to the east staircase and the ground floor. They were not on the house maps. She had found them in the third week by following a draft that had no logical source, and she had spent subsequent evenings confirming which doors opened from which sides, which latches held, which windows could be unlatched from within. She told herself she did this because useful knowledge was always useful. She did not examine the thought too closely. The fire began at 2 in the morning. Clara was already awake. She had been awake since 1, sitting at the nursery desk with Thomas's medical notes and the grain contract figures. The two things she could do something about when the letter in her pocket was the one thing she could not yet decide. She smelled the smoke before she heard anything. A thin, acrid thread of it working through the gap beneath the nursery door. She was in the corridor in seconds. The smell was stronger here and coming from the direction of the chimney breast. The nursery wing flue, which she had noted 3 weeks ago, was overdue for cleaning and had mentioned to the steward, who had said he would see to it. She went back into the nursery and woke the children without raising her voice. "Up now," she told them. "Quietly. We're going out the back way." Thomas woke immediately and reached for her hand. The youngest ward, a girl of 4 named B, was harder. She was deep in sleep and confused, and Clara lifted her and settled her against her shoulder. Alice stood in the doorway in her nightgown, taking in the smell of smoke with the same measuring look she had given Clara on the landing 2 months ago. "The back passage?" Clara said to her. "The one behind the linen press. Do you know it?" Alice said, "I've seen it." "Good. Lead Thomas. I have B." Alice took Thomas by the hand without being asked twice. The linen press door opened on the second try. The passage beyond was dark and narrow and smelled of cold stone, and Clara navigated it by memory. Left at the junction, 7 steps to the corner, the passage widening slightly before the window at the end. She had confirmed 3 weeks ago that the window latch could be worked from inside. Her hands found it now in the dark and worked it free, and the windows swung out onto the lower roof, and the cold night air came in with the smell of rain. The iron service ladder was where she remembered it. She got Alice and Thomas down first, then lowered B to Alice's arms, and was halfway down herself when her left forearm caught the edge of the stone coping. A sharp, bright pain that she registered and set aside. Gabriel found them on the lawn. She heard him before she saw him, his voice calling from the direction of the main entrance, edged with something raw and unguarded that she had never heard from him before. Then he was running across the wet grass toward them. and he stopped when he saw all four of them standing there. Alice holding Thomas's hand, Bea already half asleep again on Clara's shoulder, Clara herself with her left forearm pressed against her side. He stood on the wet grass and looked at them for a long moment. He did not speak. "The flue," Clara said. "The nursery wing chimney. I mentioned it to Ferris 3 weeks ago." Gabriel dropped to his knees in the grass. He looked at the children, Alice, Thomas, Bea, and then he looked at Clara and at the arm she was holding against herself. "Let me see it," he said. "It's not serious." "Clara." His voice was different now. All the formal correctness burned off. Something underneath it that had no performance in it at all. "Let me see your arm." She held it out. He took it with both hands, carefully, turning it toward the light from the house windows. The burn ran along the forearm, red and raw, not deep but wide enough to matter. He held her arm in both hands and did not let go of it. "I have been wrong," he said. Not to her specifically, not to anyone in particular. He said it to the wet grass and the dark and the smoke still threading out of the nursery wing above them. "About everything. I have been wrong about everything." The children were taken to the steward's house before the hour was out, Alice carrying Bea with a steadiness that made Clara's chest ache. Dr. Hartley arrived to dress the burn. Not deep, he confirmed, though it would be painful for some weeks. Gabriel sat on the low garden wall nearby and did not go inside. When the doctor had gone and the house was quiet around its damage and the smoke had thinned to almost nothing, Clara sat down beside Gabriel on the wall. The pre-dawn light was beginning at the edges of the sky, thin and gray. She put her hand in her pocket and took out the letter. "Mrs. Pruitt gave me this," she said. "The night of her collapse. She told me what it was and where it came from, and I've been carrying it for 3 weeks, trying to understand when to give it to you." Gabriel looked at the envelope. He recognized the handwriting, she could tell. She watched something move across his face that had no name she could give it. "She didn't leave for a lover," Clara said. "Mrs. Pruitt invented that. There was a dismissal she blamed Serafina for, a relation of hers, and she was angry. And the lie was small at first, and then it wasn't. The truth is that Serafina's mother was dying, and she asked you for the carriage, and you were distracted, and you said no, meaning to come back to it. She arranged her own passage. The road was bad. What followed was the longest silence she had sat through since she arrived at Rothmere. Gabriel opened the letter. He read it in the thin pre-dawn light, and she watched him read it. Watched him reach the end, and read it again, and then sit with it folded in his hands and look at the dark garden. "I told myself she ran," he said at last. "I told myself that was what women did when the estate was difficult and the money was short and the husband wasn't. I told myself it was what I deserved to expect." He paused. "I built everything on that. Every decision I made about you. From the moment I agreed to the match, I had already decided what you would eventually do. I was going to be right about it. It was the only way I knew how to survive it again." Clara listened. "I nearly didn't reach the stairs in time," he said. "The smoke was already through the upper corridor. I stood there and I couldn't get to them, and I thought—" He stopped. "And then you were already on the lawn." He turned toward her. He was still holding her burned arm, she realized. He had not let go of it, even sitting here, keeping it cradled in both hands with the particular carefulness of a man afraid of causing more damage. He looked at her with something that had no armor left in it. He kissed her once, unsteady, brief, a man who had nearly run out of time and knew it. His hand stayed careful around her burned arm throughout, as if the carefulness were the point. as if he were practicing something he intended to continue. In the weeks following the fire, the nursery wing was rebuilt. The work went quickly, supervised by Clara and the estate carpenter, and the old servant's passage was properly opened and cleaned and added to the house maps. Gabriel had it labeled in Clara's name. A small notation in the estate records, formal and permanent, the kind of thing that would outlast them both. He also sent for his solicitor, and for Clara's, a London man she had engaged quietly in her first month at Rothmere, which was the correspondence Priscilla had distorted into something sinister. Both men arrived on a Thursday morning and were shown to the formal study. Gabriel was already seated when Clara came in. He did not explain in advance what the document said. He let her read it. A revised guardianship arrangement for Alice, Thomas, and Bea, assigning joint custody to both Gabriel and Clara, with equal standing before the law. Permanent, witnessed, binding. Clara read it through twice. "You didn't ask me," she said. "No," Gabriel said. "I didn't want to ask. I wanted to do it." She looked up at him. He held her gaze. "I've been wrong about what a marriage made for practical reasons becomes," he said. "I was wrong about that before you arrived, and I was wrong about it every day until the night on the lawn. And I intend to spend a considerable time being wrong about it in the opposite direction." Both solicitors signed. Gabriel signed. Clara signed. When the solicitors had gathered their papers and been shown out, Gabriel told her that the passage behind the linen press had been given a proper door, with a latch that worked from both sides. "Good," Clara said. "I've also had the chimney flues inspected," he said. "All of them." "I noticed," she said. "I checked your work." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but the thing that lives next to one. Some weeks after that, on an evening when the nursery was quiet and Alice had fallen asleep over her letters and Thomas and Bea were already in their beds, Clara walked along the corridor toward the rooms she and Gabriel shared, and the door closed behind them both for the first time by mutual choice, not arrangement. The candle on the mantelpiece burned low. The house was quiet around them. 30 years on, the great hall at Rothmere was a different room, not different in its bones. The stone was the same, the east grate the same, the wide oak doors that opened onto the drive still swelling slightly in autumn rain. But the noise in it was different. There were grandchildren at the long table, 3 of them at least. And Bea's eldest daughter was attempting to explain something about a horse to Thomas's youngest. And Alice was 40 now, gray at her temples, with her mother's hands and her own particular authority, was overseeing the laying of the table with the specific competence of a woman who had learned it young. Edward sat near the fire. He was old now, white-haired, thinner than he had been, with the particular quality of stillness that comes to men who have watched a great deal of life from a particular angle and have made their peace with most of it. Beside him sat a great-granddaughter of 5 or 6, too young to know the names of half the people in the room, who had been watching the hall with wide eyes and had finally arrived at the question that 5-year-olds always arrive at eventually. How did they meet? She asked. The Duke and Duchess. How did they come to be married? Edward looked at her for a moment. Outside the window, the autumn rain was doing what autumn rain at Rothmere always did. Arriving from the north, gray and relentless, streaking the old glass. It was a day very much like this one, Edward said. October. Rain still on her cloak when she came through that door there. He nodded toward the great oak doors at the far end of the hall. The whole household was assembled to greet her. And your great-great-uncle, my brother Gabriel, who was the cleverest man I ever knew in most respects, was standing with his back to the door. And he said something to me. Edward paused. Something I have regretted passing on every day since. The child looked at him with the patient attention of someone who has not yet learned to pretend she isn't interested. He said she wouldn't last a week, Edward said. He said it in front of the assembled staff, and she was 3 steps inside the door, and she heard every word of it. What did she do? The child asked. She curtsied to him, Edward said, as if she hadn't heard a syllable. And then she asked the housekeeper to show her the nursery. He was quiet for a moment. Across the room, Clara was coming down the main stairs. 70 years old now, her hair white, moving carefully but without assistance. Her left forearm bearing the faint mark of an old burn that had never entirely faded. Gabriel was at the bottom of the stairs waiting for her, which was where he had been waiting for her, in one form or another, for 33 years. He offered his hand. She took it. And then? The child asked. And then, Edward said, watching his brother take his wife's hand at the bottom of the stairs. He spent the next 33 years being wrong. Thoroughly, completely, and, I think I can say this with some confidence, happily wrong. He settled back in his chair. It is the finest thing I have ever watched a man do. The fire crackled in the east grate. The rain came down outside. At the long table, Alice called everyone to their places, and the grandchildren came running, and the great hall at Rothmere filled with the noise of people who had been given the chance to love one another properly, and had taken it